The first thing we'll be discussing is subject-verb agreement. A complete sentence contains one subject plus one verb. A verb is an action, for example, play, work, eat, etc. And a subject is the object doing the action, and that will always be a noun.
In a sentence, the subject and the verb must always match. For example, we have the sentence, "The differences between the flowers is obvious to everyone." In this sentence, the subject is the differences, and the verb is. The subject is plural, and is, the verb, is singular. We can see that these don't match, so we must change the verb to be plural. Therefore, the sentence changes to, "The differences between the flowers are obvious to everyone." We have two more simpler sentences, which are "A dog barks" and "Dogs bark." In the first sentence, we can see that both the subject, which is a dog, and the verb, which is barks, are both singular. Here, in the second sentence, dogs is the subject and bark is the verb, and both are plural. When the subject is singular in the present tense, verbs must have an S at the end. When the subject is plural, no S is required. So a lot of people can get confused by which subject is the noun when there are multiple nouns in one sentence. So what we have to remember is that the first noun is the subject, not the noun closest to the verb. So, for example, in the sentence above, it says, "A group of people blank ready to drive to the airport." So the subject is going to be group, not people. And because group is singular, we also need the verb to be singular. So the verb is going to be was. This can be a common mistake because a lot of people might think that the subject is people, and in that case, it's plural, so then people would say, "A group of people were ready to drive to the airport." But it's actually, "A group of people was ready to drive to the airport," because the subject, which is group, is singular. So which and that, and by extension who, are different from other clause openers because they can be subjects if they are directly before the verb. But if they're directly before a noun, then the noun is the subject as it usually would be. So for example, here, the first subject is I, and the first verb is took. The second subject is which, because it is directly in front of was, which is a verb. In the second sentence, I is the first subject and took is the first verb. And however, because which is in front of a noun and not a verb, Lucy, the noun, becomes the subject instead of which. And the second verb becomes took.
Some sentences have more than one subject-verb pairings, which means that there is more than one clause in the sentence. And these clauses need to be linked by a select number of words. For example, but, which, that, since, and, who, although, etc. These words are called clause openers. An example sentence is, "Some people like city life, although others prefer the country." The first subject-verb pairings is people, which is the first subject, and like, which is the first verb. The second pairing is others as the second subject, and prefer as the second verb. And in this sentence, the clause opener that are connecting the two clauses is although.
In modifiers and prepositional phrases, there's no subject, and they cannot stand by themselves. So, for example, in this sentence, "In the middle of the desert, a cactus grows," we have the independent clause, which is a cactus grows. In this, the subject is the cactus, and the verb is grows. The phrase in the middle of the desert has no subject, and therefore cannot stand by itself, so it must be attached to an independent clause. Parallelism is the repetition of the same grammatical elements in a sentence. So here are some examples of that. The first sentence is, I dress beautifully, stylishly, and practically. So you can see that all of these adverbs end in ly. Beautifully, stylishly, and practically. So they are all parallel. In the second sentence, it says, I am beautiful, stylish, and practical. So these are all in present tense. And the third sentence says, I am beautiful, am stylish, and am practical. So these are all parallel. And they are all in am plus present. In the final sentence, it says, I sing beautifully, dress stylishly, and act practically. So these are all parallel because it is a verb plus ly. So here are some examples of incorrect sentences. So it says, I am beautiful, stylish, and act practically. So here, this is present, and this is also present. But this is verb plus ly. So this is not parallel with the other ones. To make it parallel, we would have to say, I am beautiful, stylish, and practical, which would make them all present tense and all parallel.
When identifying parallelism, we first have to identify the grammatical structure, which is the tense. For shorter sentences, for example, I am beautiful, stylish, and practical, we already know that the tense is present, and so that's the only thing we need to find. However, in longer sentences, such as, the students told the teachers that they want more recess, that they want less homework, and that they want shorter classes, we also need to identify where the repetition begins. In this sentence, the repetition begins with that they want more recess, that they want less homework, and that they want shorter classes. For this sentence, we can find the grammatical structure, the tense, because want, the verb, is present, and so we know that this sentence is in present tense. Overlapping parallelism is when there's two lists within one sentence. For example, when returning to boarding school, students must pack their clothes, book their flights, and meet with their friends, cousins, and grandparents to say goodbye. Initially, this sentence may seem confusing, but it's important to identify the two separate lists within it. The first list is the students' actions: pack their clothes, book their flights, and meet with their friends. The second list is the people that the student is meeting with, which is their friends, cousins, and grandparents.
Sentence structure. A clause is a part of a sentence that has both a subject and a verb. An independent clause can stand alone. An example of an independent clause is, I have a dog. The subject is I, and the verb is have. A dependent clause, on the other hand, cannot stand alone. A dependent clause always begins with a dependent clause opener. So, for example, to make an independent clause a dependent clause, you would add a dependent clause opener like because. Because I have a dog cannot stand by itself. So that makes it a dependent clause. Examples of dependent clause openers are when, because, as, if, whereas, while, whenever, although, and all of the fanboys. The fanboys are conjunctions for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Next, we are going to talk about independent clause, comma, independent clause. So for example, we have, I am tall, comma, my best friend is quite short. I am tall is an independent clause, and my best friend is quite short is also an independent clause. However, this sentence is not grammatically correct, but we can join two independent clauses in three different ways. The first way that we can join two independent clauses to make a grammatically correct sentence is with the DC opener, which the examples of which we have up here. So, for the first sentence, we have I am tall, which is an independent clause, and my best friend is quite short, which is also an independent clause. And we can join this with, for example, whereas, which is a DC opener. Now the sentence is, I am tall, whereas my best friend is quite short, which is grammatically correct. The next way is by using a conjunction. I am tall is our independent clause again. My best friend is quite short is our other independent clause. And we can join that with, for example, but, which is a conjunction. I am tall, but my best friend is quite short. The last way is by using a logic word. So we have our independent clauses, and then we can join them with a logic word, which is any word that makes sense in context. So, for example, we could use here, however. Which is our logic word. Notice how when we use however, we have to add a semicolon here and a comma here for it to be grammatically correct. So here we can see that when you have a DC opener, you can change up the order of the sentence a little bit. So for the first one, it's independent clause, comma, dependent clause, opener. So you have independent clause here, and you have your dependent clause opener, whereas, right after the independent clause. In the second example, you have a dependent clause opener, comma, independent clause. So that means that you can put whereas at the beginning of the sentence and have your independent clause after. In the last example, it's independent clause, dependent clause opener. So you have your independent clause, and then you have your dependent clause opener. But see how we have to change the dependent clause opener, because here there is no comma. So we have to see what makes sense with no comma.
If a conjugation is placed in between two independent clauses, a comma is always required. For example, the sentence, I am bad at history, but I am good at math. The first independent clause is I am bad at history, and the second is I am good at math. But in this sentence is the conjunction, and because it's a place in between two independent clauses, a comma is necessary. However, if a conjugation is placed in between an independent clause and a dependent clause, no comma is necessary. For example, I am bad at history but good at math. I am bad at history is the independent clause. Good at math is the dependent clause. And so the conjunction but can be left alone with no comma in front of it. Logic words have flexible positioning because they do not touch grammar and they are able to be taken out of the sentence. In this sentence, she is tall, however, he is short. However is the logic word, and it is placed in between two independent clauses. However, this sentence can be written differently. She is tall, he, however, is short. She is tall, he is, however, short. And she is tall, he is short, however. All these sentences are grammatically correct, but the first sentence, in which the logic word is placed in between two independent clauses, is the most logical and most preferred. An independent clause plus a dependent clause equals an independent clause. For example, the sentence, I need to stay because the event was my idea, I have to help clean up. The sentence can be seen in many ways. It can be seen as three separate clauses. I need to stay being an independent clause. Because the event was my idea is a dependent clause. And I have to help clean up is a second independent clause. This can be seen as three separate clauses, but it can also be seen as two independent clauses. Because when just looking at the dependent clause and second independent clause together, because the event was my idea, I have to help clean up, it becomes an independent clause. And so the structure of the whole sentence is independent clause and independent clause.